In the aftermath of the failed Jacobite Rising and the devastating Battle of Culloden, the way of life for Scottish clans was shattered. English forces swept through Scotland, burning homes, seizing lands, and forcing families to flee. MacDonald and countless others were left to face the grim reality of cultural erasure. The Crown imposed a series of laws designed to extinguish the identity of the Scottish people. The Disarming Act confiscated weapons. The Dress Act banned kilts and tartans, and the Heritable Jurisdiction Act stripped clan chiefs of their authority. These acts dismantled the clan system, shattering their way of life. Gaelic language, deeply tied to clan identity, was marginalised as English became the language of law and education, accelerating the erosion of Highland culture.
It was an appalling battle because the brave Highlanders who didn't have all the equipment, didn't have all the training that the government troops had, were dealt with very harshly, very mercilessly. There were executions, in fact, of prisoners after the battle had taken place. There were a lot of Highland casualties there, and if you go to the battlefield, you can see the graves, you can see the cairns were erected in subsequent times to commemorate the sacrifice the devoted Highland clansmen had made to this particular cause, which their leaders had believed in.
The effects of Culloden were extraordinarily drastic for the Highlanders. So a series of acts stripped the Highland chiefs of any authority, forbade Highlanders to carry arms. And you understand that for the traditional Highlander, carrying arms was part of the way in which you existed. And above all, forbade them to wear their traditional kilts. It undressed them. And so it stripped the culture of its essential social and cultural identity. And it led to the flow of a totally different culture. The Duke of Cumberland becomes the Butcher of Culloden, whose vicious approach actually maybe wasn't entirely attributable to him, but he followed his orders, and the orders were he had to somehow pacify Scotland. And pacify Scotland meant, effectively, wiping out any potential rebel. And then to capture Bonnie Prince Charlie, because Charles was somewhere. And where was he? And words were going out in all sorts of directions about where he might be. And eventually, various spies and traitors lead them to the Outer Hebrides. And in the Outer Hebrides, they then try to isolate the Outer Hebrides, and they'll perhaps surround it and capture Charles Edward Stuart. This would be the perfect end to the rebellion. If they had Charles Edward, they would behead him, because that's what you did with royalty. Actually, it was the English who called him the Butcher of Culloden. because English people were shocked in a very deep way that this, in many ways, little rebellion should turn into a bloody episode. And English newspapers in London were shocked at his ruthlessness. In some ways, he wasn't necessarily a ruthless character. You know, he eventually resigned in discontent when George II did not like his strategy for dealing with other military issues. He was a high-principled man, but high-principled people are sometimes very dangerous when they are given instructions to kill. And so they search, and they even set up a passport system. You will need a royal pass if you're going to go from the Outer Hebrides back into the Inner Hebrides. These are the islands off the west of Scotland. And Charles is there. Fascinatingly, he is then rescued in one of those dazzling stories that has always been a high point in this. Well, it's kind of a romance. It's the way it's told.
Amid the darkness, stories of resilience and heroism emerged. Flora MacDonald, a courageous Highlander from the Outer Hebrides, risked her life to aid the fugitive Bonnie Prince Charlie. Disguising him as a maid, she smuggled him across the treacherous water of the Hebrides, a bold act of defiance against the Crown's relentless pursuit.
So this is Flora MacDonald, who disguises the prince as a woman, dresses him up in, these clothes that they will not be seen, gets a pass, an extra pass, through very dubious circumstances, and brings Charles into the Inner Hebrides and arranges for him in hiding and perfectly covers his departure into the Scottish Highlands, where he will be impossible to find. A few months later, it does take a while, he is picked up by a French fleet and hastily escapes back to France and never to be seen in Scotland again. And then come the reprisals. So Flora ends up in the Tower of London. I find the character of Flora incredibly interesting, and I'm not the only one. Dr. Johnson, 2 centuries ago, determined to meet this remarkable woman who had the calm self-possession that she could take a nuisance of a prince and could bring him safely to where he could escape. This is a woman of great calmness, very worried about the likely implications for her family, but utterly faithful to the Jacobite cause. She is the one who comes out with great reputation. Many Scots pay heavily for the price of the rebellion. And although the story is a little bit exaggerated, in a sense this marks the death knell to Highland culture.
The Highland clearances were a catastrophic turning point for Scotland during the late 18th and 19th century. Overcrowding, failed crops, and the collapse of traditional industries had already left many families struggling to survive. Landlords, eager to profit from sheep farming, seized this opportunity to clear tenants from their ancestral homes. Entire villages were evicted, homes were burned, and communities were shattered to make way for grazing land. For families like the MacDonalds of Cull, the pressures of survival became unbearable. The clearances stripped them of their livelihoods, their homes, and their connection to the land that had defined their way of life for centuries.
The Highland clearances, as they're called, are probably the most controversial and infamous episode in Scottish history. It's a term that's loosely applied to quite a long period of time when the land was cleared of its population because of agricultural reforms that were being brought in, primarily from the south. Fundamentally, it meant that people left the Highlands and the islands, in a lot of cases voluntarily. Later on, not so voluntarily, they were coerced to leave. It was because of that that what you now see in the Highlands and the islands are lots and lots of deserted villages, or townships as they call them. So the land was cleared. What was once a very populated territory of land is now exactly the opposite. Their way of life for the ordinary townspeople, as opposed to the chiefs, would have been a hard one. The vast majority of their time would have been spent producing food, primarily for their own consumption, but also in part payment of the rents due to their chief, which the chief might use for himself, or he might then export to the lowlands for a cash benefit. Life was becoming more difficult. Rents were going up. There were increasing periods of destitution brought on by crop failure and by cattle disease. Life was getting to be tougher than it had been before. And this is well documented as records have improved as the centuries have rolled on.
By the 19th century, capitalism is starting to want land to be a much more defined area of property where the owner has no constraint on what they can do. So that's evolving, and it means pushing people out of their customary rights to land.
New Zealanders would love the Highlands because there's something about the Highlands that reflects a very barren, tough culture where actually making the land fertile and produce well is extremely hard work. I can remember first taking a train across the Highlands at one stage and being staggered by how bleak it was until you get to the locks. And it's from these highlands that came the last remnants of a simple crofter culture where clans organised themselves with elected heads, the heads of the clans, and kept closely together, sharing a great deal in common, largely running cattle, and they lived a very bare subsistence existence, and the culture was hard pressed, and the people were tough. You had to be tough and determined to live in these simple stone cottages and to exist in small, we'd call them tribal units, which were the last remnants of, if you like, the ancient culture of Europe.
Historically, within the Isles, the clan system meant that you were living with the environment and being sustained by the environment in a way that was collective. As political pressures came into play, that changed and land started to be segmented, and they had very small parcels of land, just some of them, not everybody had access to it, called crofts. And what happened from there was, because they became valuable to be able to feed families, families would partition it up smaller and smaller as more and more children were born and generations came through. The impact of this was that they didn't have enough to sustain themselves.
Driven by economic hardship and political change, the promise of new opportunities in faraway places was a beacon of hope. The journey was an escape from a life of poverty and hardship. An extreme sense of loss was palpable as many left behind family, community that had been the foundation of their identity for centuries.
So Hector and his family were allowed and chosen to travel on the Skeleton. I think coming to New Zealand really gave him an opportunity to learn and extend his knowledge and share his abilities with other people, which was fantastic, particularly with local iwi.
I must say, I have found the story of Hector MacDonald fascinating in putting an extra aspect into the history of the Manawatu, even before that part of the country becomes Europeanised and the land grabs take place. So imagine Hector, the whaler, coming in, having to learn te reo, having to accommodate himself to this world, and proving to be exactly the personality that is required to accommodate to that world, where he is not clinging on to his Scottish traditions intensely, though he hasn't forgotten them.
So any family, and clearly Hector's family was a case in point, who had the means, by which I mean the finances, to think of an alternative way of life, which basically meant leaving and finding a new land, would consider doing that. And that's clearly what he did. But the interesting thing to me is that Hector MacDonald's family, families like him, they had the courage to actually undertake, by the standards of the time, were epic voyages that would take months on end to reach a new land where they wouldn't necessarily know very much about what they would find, what reception they would get, and how they would be able to set up shop, so to speak, in this new territory. Looking at it from that point of view, they were making a huge gamble. What a courageous thing to do, to embark on an epic adventure in the hope of improving one's lot.
So what prompted Scottish people to migrate in such numbers during the 19th century was often the lure of opportunity. For somebody from a reasonably comfortable lower middle class background like Hector MacDonald's family, there were things to attract them. Scotland's population was increasing, and that in itself meant that you had to think about how you were going to make a living. Agriculture was improving, becoming more efficient, and that meant perhaps fewer opportunities if you'd stayed at home farming. So the lure of the colonies was quite real, and the hope was that by a few years of sacrifice and perhaps even hard work, you would end up with a bit more comfort than if you'd stayed at home.
So large numbers go to North America, and later, of course, significant numbers come to Australia and New Zealand. And even in New Zealand, at Waipu, a distinctive group of those who were cleared out come and create a little Gaelic settlement right there on the Northland coast. A fascinating remnant of Gaelic culture survived when it had almost completely been lost in Scotland.
Sailing from Scotland to Aotearoa was long, difficult, and often treacherous. The voyage took several months by ship, with conditions that were often cramped, unsanitary, and hazardous. The promise of fertile soil and opportunity in Aotearoa beckoned. Their quest for a new life would begin if they survived this brutal journey to the end of the world.